Snow fell silently on huddled but determined families, shouldering their life's possessions as they braved Korea's piercingly cold winter of 1950. Nearing 200,000 refugees total, North Korean civilians had joined the march of UN soldiers seeking refuge from the advancing Chinese forces. Refugee motivations for joining the perilous journey south vary, from fear of communist persecution for their religious beliefs, to the assistance they may have given to UN forces in daily life and battle.
What really impacted me was not so much the war itself, but the results of the war, the refugees fleeing and the fear in their eyes, and the children carrying their belongings, which were minimal, and running for their lives. And I saw that every day, and that stayed with me.
The Battle of Zhangjin Reservoir, also known as the Chosin Reservoir, had come to a bloody conclusion. Encirclement by the Chinese People's Volunteer Army placed the fate of UN soldiers and North Korean civilians alike in a precarious position. As they marched towards possible deliverance and survival by reaching the port of Heungnam, the threat of bloodshed in the snow haunted their every step. The Chinese military had shown a tactical adeptness since entering the Korean War, waiting until road-bound UN forces were stretched thin before launching surprise nighttime assaults that left shocked soldiers dead in the snow. The sheer number of Chinese forces alone seemed nearly impossible to stop, though UN forces, outnumbered 4-1 at battles like Zhangjin, held the line long enough to allow survivors to retreat and escape. The U.S. Marines 1st Division fought in tandem with soldiers from the 10th U.S. Army Corps, United Kingdom, and Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army to ensure that these military maneuvers were successful, despite the high personal cost many soldiers ultimately paid.
In mid to late November, there had been increasing signs of Chinese intervention. We had seen Chinese troops in the area and encountered them in battles and defeated them pretty well. And on the night of the 25th of November, I think it was, we were in defensive positions, and Chinese forces had attacked all of our locations and overran some of our positions, killing a lot of Marines. At Heungnam, they overrun some of our positions, but we quickly regrouped and began a severe battle for survival. We were tremendously overwhelmed by their massive numbers, and it was a tough battle fighting there in the cold, in temperatures that probably went down to 35 or 40 degrees below zero. We weren't prepared for a heavy-duty winter campaign, and a lot of people got frostbite and ultimately lost limbs, but we were able to consolidate our positions and fight back and defend ourselves.
Commander of the UN forces, General Douglas MacArthur, had waved off reports that Chinese soldiers were operating in Korea, endangering UN forces at the Zhangjin Reservoir through disregard and underestimation. Caught off guard, encircled, and heavily outnumbered by nearly 120,000 Chinese soldiers, MacArthur was forced to send orders to evacuate and save the soldiers now known as the Chosen Few.
When we got above the Pyongyang and the side of the Yellow, as I say, we noticed the difference. We noticed refugees. And we thought, well, why are they coming back? Why are they coming back? And what they were doing, we didn't know it at the time, and the Americans weren't sure at first, but the Chinese had entered the war. And of course, as soon as the Chinese came across the Yellow, the Americans started a retreat, and that forced the civilians to go before them. As they were retreating, refugees was going down.
While MacArthur's retreat at the Battle of Zhangjin may seem a loss, the conflict stands as one of the biggest battles in U.S. Marines history The Marines' stalwart endurance as their numbers were assaulted provided the essential military resistance and rescue that significantly influenced later battles, ensuring the continued existence of South Korea. Retreat and evacuation were daunting, however. The most feasible evacuation point was the beleaguered port of Heungnam, located nearly 80 miles away through mountains and snow.
Cold. It's the coldest place in the world. You get up on them hills up there, 40 below, that's what I remember.
UN forces began their withdrawal from Udamri and Hagaru-ri, but were stalled at Kodori as the Funchulin Pass Bridge on the only road out of Zhangjian Reservoir had been partially blown. An emergency engineering request was made for treadway bridge sections to be dropped at a makeshift drop zone in Kodori, an attempt that had never been made in warfare history. On the night of the drop, a snowstorm threatened the mission. Soldiers on the ground were on the brink of losing all hope when in the night sky the star of Kodori broke through the wintry haze.
Our success and survival depended a great deal upon the teamwork that we had with our aviation. And they did a marvelous job when they could, but when it was actually snowing in a snowstorm, we couldn't use it. And as we were coming out, there was another snowstorm, heavy snowstorm. For a fairly extended period, over a day, we had no air to support us.
The weather was so bad, we had to have air support in order to drop the bridges and in order to fend off the Chinese and their attacks. So the one thing we did is we prayed. Please help us. We need clear weather. That night, the sky opened up with all of this bad weather, and there was one star that we saw. One very bright star. We didn't have much hope just looking at the weather and getting the weather predictions that we were able to get. We weren't able to get too much because of our location. So we did pray. And it opened up and there it was. We knew then that we were going to be able to have air support and we were going to be able to get our bridges.
I was a Corps engineer and my staff actually thought of the idea, but the Air Force said, no, you can't drop parts of the bridge out because the load is so great that when you drop them out, the pilot will lose control of the airplane. So they finally found one Lieutenant Colonel Air Force pilot who was brave enough to try to drop the bridge out, and it was successful. We hooked up 3 parachutes when we actually dropped the parts into the chosen reservoir and bolted them together and pushed them across the reservoir gap. Chinese actually coming in and fighting, shooting at us as we were building the bridge, and almost interrupted it. The Marines did take a hill which protected us from enough to be able to build a bridge, and we built the bridge and held off the Chinese long enough so we could evacuate all the Marines and Army soldiers too that were up there back down to the south to Heungnam.
The star offered a sign of clearer skies for the drop to take place and the evacuation plans to continue. Heungnam was maintaining the safety of her walls and roads with the help of UN forces. That safety had begun to evaporate as the guarded perimeter extending beyond the port began shrinking. Chinese forces had begun closing all roads south, killing soldiers and civilians in their brutally swift attacks. The lives of hundreds of thousands stood in the balance as they raced to beat the oncoming Chinese to the temporarily safe gates of the port of Heungnam. As the advance of Chinese soldiers grew ever closer, UN forces and refugees flooded the streets of Heungnam, rushing to reach the safety of departing ships.
Remember them, all of these refugees, these North Koreans that was wanting to flee North Korea because of the oppression they'd been under, evidently. And there was somewhere around, they tell us around 98 to 100,000. And I remember on the roadway coming, the last few miles, coming into that Heungnam of these old men and women and little children with whatever they could carry, and little kids carrying little kids. But coming out of that mountain, as we came looked down and come around the curve, we saw that seaport with those ships out there waiting for us. And it was just I don't know if it was a moment of relief or unbelief of we finally have come this far. As we come around there and saw those ships, we were kind of war-torn at that time. Somebody said, "Straighten up," and they started singing the Marine Corps hymn, and everybody just started marching. And it was quite a feeling to see those ships and to know that we were coming out.
The UN commanders were ordered to evacuate the 10th Corps and its weapons and carry them to the south so they could continue to fight. Taking refugees was not part of the plan. Ships such as the USS Meredith Victory were not designed for such a large civilian boarding. They were built to only carry 12 passengers with a 47-person crew. However, despite the danger and dwindling time, the UN command ultimately decided to evacuate as many refugees as possible after Colonel Edward Forney, the evacuation control officer of Port Heungnam and U.S. Marine Corps, urged the chain of command to quickly approve rescue of civilians. Soldiers soon lined the streets of Heungnam, urging the weary refugees to hurry forward towards the already heavily laden ships. With approval granted and the rescue mission fully in swing, over 100,000 Korean refugees loaded aboard the departing ships, filling empty spaces between and on top of tanks and trucks.
Where I really saw the suffering was in Heungnam, boarding the ships, and those people trying to get out of there, evacuated, getting on the ship. The little ones, the ones that, I remember the little children. They were with parents, some of them. Some of them were being carried. Some of them, little ones, holding on to their brother or sister. They wanted to get on that ship and get out of there. And they were carrying heavy loads, and I don't know what they want. They had their only belongings. I was thinking about those people, and I was thinking about my Native American people that had gone through something like that. But I was just, I won't say happy, I was just glad to get out safely.
As urgency neared panic and the last remaining soldiers were loaded, the grim reality that not all refugees would fit aboard the departing ships became apparent. With the bulk of weaponry, soldiers, and refugees loaded, UN forces equipment, weapons, and tools of warfare that could not fit aboard the ships was abandoned in the streets. With Chinese forces approaching, the military supplies had to be destroyed or risk being used by enemy troops. As the UN ships sailed for safety on Christmas Eve, loaded to capacity with soldiers and civilians alike, the port of Heungnam was destroyed through artillery fire of the United States Navy. Blasts erupted through the surrounding mountains as the ash of destruction joined the snow already falling to the ground.
We provided gunfire support to all get within our range, so they could start loading all the troops, and then so after there was thousands of ships, all sorts, fishing boats and everything. Of course, civilians and all. A couple 100,000 civilians. Everybody was coming out of there. Of course, as soon as we pulled out, of course, they had demolition teams, and we also bombarded the city so they wouldn't have anything to use, the enemy, it was worthwhile. So That was a big evacuation, yeah. So then we helped escort them down to where they either dropped them off at Busan or somewhere else.
Freezing ocean waves pounded the ships as they sailed for the safety of South Korea. Decks and cargo holds crowded with families huddling together as they considered their new future. USS Meredith Victory carried 14,000 refugees aboard its vessel alone, hosting the birth of 5 refugee babies as it traveled to the safety of the southern shore. These babies were all nicknamed KIMCHI and numbered in order of birth, adding humor and joy to a tense journey. Worries over possible North Korean spies among the refugees had kept them from disembarking at Busan. But as the refugees filed onto the shores of Koje Island, hope and possibility overtook suspicion. Through this Christmas miracle, the North Korean refugees escaped the threat of Chinese forces, the political regime of North Korea, and began a new life in South Korea. An estimated 1 million descendants of these refugees, including the family of South Korean President Moon Jae-in, can trace their family's legacy to the evacuation from the port of Heungnam. As terrible and bloody a historical event as the Battle of Jeongjin Reservoir was, the evacuation from Heungnam showed the possibility of hope and human perseverance at the darkest hour.